My last video comparing Fender and Squier precision basses got a lot of views, for my channel anyway, and a bunch of new subscribers. If you're one of them, welcome. Anytime I produce a video that juices the algorithm the way that one did, I'm afraid I'm going to let down my new viewers by doing something radically different in the next one. But the fact is, this is me. I'm all over the place. I try to make videos I think people will enjoy, otherwise what's the point? But ultimately, I'm still going to be me. That's the only thread of continuity here. Whether it's bass gear, jazz music theory, or the tangled histories of quirky prog rock bands, I'm coming at it all with my minutia-obsessed music geek's perspective. Very little of what I talk about on this channel is really important to the world in any kind of meaningful way. But honestly, although I do care immensely about the big issues of the day, and today definitely has big issues, it all overwhelms me pretty easily, especially right now. I need to retreat frequently into the geeky stuff to restore myself. And judging by the generally positive responses I get on my videos, I must be filling that need for other people too. Still, maybe you love my takes on music gear, but you don't give a crap about my tastes in music. Never fear. My 100-point review of the Fender Player 2 modified precision bass is coming soon. If nothing else crazy happens in the meantime, it should be my next video. But right now, here's something completely different. I hope you like it.
And now for something completely different.
I'm a big fan of the band Genesis. So much so that I'm inclined to give my whole musical life story as a fan of Genesis and Peter Gabriel right up front, but, well, it's all going to come out as we go anyway, so let's just get into it. Here's my ranking of all 15 Genesis studio albums, worst to best, in my opinion. Number 14, Tie. From Genesis to Revelation, 1969. Calling All Stations, 1997. These are the first and last studio albums produced under the name Genesis, but neither of them really sounds like Genesis to me. I should put an asterisk next to that because, honestly, I can't bring myself to listen to either of them. I've been a Genesis fan for over 40 years, but I have never heard either of these albums in its entirety. I'm pretty sure I've never listened to more than a minute straight of Calling All Stations. It just sucks. I don't blame what's-his-name. He's not a bad singer, but he doesn't sound at all like Phil Collins, nor do the two session drummers on the album. When Peter Gabriel left, the band still sounded like Genesis because we already knew Phil's voice, and it had a similar range and timbre to Peter's. Plus, instrumentally, the band hadn't changed at all, minus the occasional flute or oboe line. But without Phil's distinctive presence, Calling All Stations just sounds anonymous and tired. I can't find any personality or joy in any of it. From Genesis to Revelation is slightly better, I suppose, in that it at least has Peter Gabriel, whose voice was already recognizable, even though he was still just a teenager. And there are brief glimmers of promise, faint hints of what's to come. Last night, while lying in bed reviewing this script on my phone, I decided to give From Genesis to Revelation one last chance. I popped in my earbuds and turned it on. And I realized that the actual music honestly isn't that bad. It's the production that absolutely ruins it. Gimmicky psychedelic studio tricks, bad stereo panning, and all of the band's instruments mashed together into one thin, muddy mess. Vocals way too loud and drenched in ludicrous amounts of reverb, and cheesy Muzak's string overdubs given much more care and attention than anything the band themselves were doing. It sounds terrible. But I did at least make it through 3 whole songs, uninterrupted, before I gave up and started skipping around to see if it ever got any better. It didn't. Then I put on Calling All Stations to see if it fared any better. Honestly, I was sick of it after 2 seconds. By a minute and 9 seconds in, I had had enough. I just can't do it. It was a clarifying tiebreaker though. Calling All Stations is the worst. Number 13, We Can't Dance, 1991. Like I said, I can't even force myself to listen to From Genesis to Revelation or Calling All Stations. But those are the only Genesis albums I have that problem with. I'll admit, I rarely choose to listen to this album either, but I can do it. Even though it's worst of the rest, and contrary to a lot of other fans' opinions, I do actually like a lot of this album. Sure, it's got some issues, production for one, but it's pretty hard to find any album made in the late 80s or early 90s, up until grunge took over, that isn't overproduced. Genesis took nearly 5 years after launching the massively successful Invisible Touch to produce their next album. A lot was going on, besides just promoting Invisible Touch. Phil Collins was at the peak of his solo career, Mike Rutherford was having major success with his other band, Mike and the Mechanics, and Tony Banks was probably doing something too. When they reconvened, it almost seemed like they knew this was going to be their last album together. The CD format really let them stretch out. There are several tracks, including 2 in excess of 10 minutes, that are a nod to their prog rock origins, even if most of the intricate details have been sanded down and buffed out. And there's a thematic thread in the lyrics, a reckoning with aging, loss, and endings. The first few tracks start off really strong, then the album kind of loses steam in the latter half. But it ends with what, in retrospect, is obviously this trio's swan song, the excellent Fading Lights, a 10.5-minute excursion that starts off atmospheric and pensive, but moves into an instrumental middle section that's steeped in prog rock vibes, with shifting moods and some bold, if a tad simplistic, playing. Wikipedia mentions that the chorus of Fading Lights is similar to ripples from the 1976 album A Trick of the Tail. I honestly don't hear that, but what I do hear is a melodic fragment that directly evokes the track Stagnation from what I would consider the band's first real album, 1970's Trespass. Speaking of which, number 12, Trespass, 1970. This may be the second Genesis album, but it's the first one that actually sounds like Genesis, even if it's still a bit tentative. Anthony Phillips and John Mayhew do a fine enough job on guitar and drums, respectively, but there's something missing. 2 somethings, really. Steve Hackett and Phil Collins. The confidence and dexterity those two brought to the band would elevate things to an entirely new level on their next album, Nursery Crime. Peter Gabriel hasn't quite found his narrative style either, although the seeds are there. The anthropomorphized wolves on White Mountain are a good example. It's not totally cringe-inducing, but there's an adolescent clumsiness to it. Still, all of this is an unbelievable transformation from their first album. The Knife, in particular, is a powerful closer, and it endured in the band's setlist long enough to make it onto their first live album 3 years later. Number 11, And Then There Were Three, 1978. There was a time back in the 90s when I thought this was the worst Genesis album. Well, second worst. It was always better than From Genesis to Revelation, and Calling All Stations didn't exist yet. Then it was third worst. Something finally clicked for me a few years ago, and I could suddenly hear how the album fit into the evolution of the Genesis sound from the full-on prog rock of the Steve Hackett years into the prog pop style the trio would execute so well on the Duke Abacab Genesis trilogy over the next 5 years. As with Trespass, it's a sound that's transitional and not fully formed. Although there are some great tracks, this album still belongs near the bottom of the list because it's definitely the weakest one from the trio lineup that achieved massive pop success in the 80s. But I was stupid to spend so many years dismissing it as garbage. Then again, that gave me the opportunity to experience a new album of classic Genesis, decades after I knew the rest of their catalog like the back of my hand. Oh, what's that? What struck me most was how much some of the songs sounded like they'd fit right in on the previous album, Wind and Wuthering, especially Down and Out, Burning Rope, Deep in the Motherlode, and The Lady Lies. Of course, there are also the first hints of the more streamlined, pop-oriented direction the band would soon move in, especially Many Too Many and the surprise hit single Follow You, Follow Me, which isn't to say those are bad songs either. What's missing here is Steve Hackett's exceptional guitar playing. When Peter Gabriel left, they made a concerted effort to find a replacement before settling on Phil Collins taking over lead vocals from within the band. When Steve left, there was no consideration of replacing him. I think secretly Mike Rutherford always wanted to be the guitarist, not the bassist. The thing is, he's nowhere near the guitarist Steve Hackett is. But this album showed maybe Steve's guitar wasn't really that essential to the core Genesis sound after all. And Then There Were Three applies to the studio band only. On stage, Genesis was still 5 guys. The excellent Chester Thompson and Daryl Sturmer became quasi-members of the band for the rest of their career, never contributing to the writing or recording of the studio albums, but ever present on tour as hired musicians. Number 10, Invisible Touch, 1986. This is kind of a tough one. Invisible Touch was the most commercially successful Genesis album of all time. In 1986 and 87, it was huge, inescapable. Heavy rotation on MTV. A massive stadium tour. One of the songs was used in a Michelob commercial. 5 hit singles, 2 of which went to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and 2 others that made the top 10. Huge. Inescapable. I was in middle school when this album came out. My high school obsession with 70s prog rock still awaited me in the future. But I was already a fan of Genesis since the moment I first heard That's All on MTV a few years earlier. I owned this album on vinyl. I spent much of the summer of 1987 hanging out in our basement rec room, blasting it on the stereo while obsessively sorting through my baseball card collection. It was all extremely mid-80s. The album has predictably huge 80s production and continued the streamlined compositional style the band had been honing throughout the early 80s, but there was still some prog rock spirit here. Even though I didn't have a name for it yet in 1987, I was fascinated by the extended, brooding instrumental section of the 9-minute album version of Tonight, 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 along with the complicated two-part structure of Domino, which clocked in at nearly 11 minutes. A rock band playing long compositions with complex instrumental sections that don't fit the conventional pop song format? Give me more. I had no idea what was waiting for me in their back catalog. So yeah, this album will always have a special place for me. I think if I did not have that personal connection with it, it would probably rate lower than And Then There Were Three. But, well, this is my list. Number 9, Abacab, 1981. The title of the title track of this album is a tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement of the band's shift toward more straightforward pop, referring to the formulaic structure of the song. The thing is, even if it has a recognizable form of verses, chorus, and bridge, it's still kind of weird for a pop song. Stabbing synths, mechanical rhythms, dry production. It signaled the ways pop music was changing in the early 80s as much as it signaled the band's own changing style. The rest of the album is full of more surprises. The Phoenix Horns from Earth, Wind & Fire on No Reply at All. The extended, almost proggy two-part suite Dodo Lurker. And of course, possibly the most perplexing song in the band's catalog, Whodunit. Like it or not, the second to last track sounds to me the most like classic Genesis, and the title sounds like a dare to their audience. But my favorite track on Abacab is the closer, Another Record. Good thing they put it at the end, so people weren't tempted to follow its guidance to put another record on. Love it, hate it, or somewhere in the middle, it looks like that's where I am. You can't deny that this was a distinctive album that really set the tone for the band's 80s work. Number 8, Genesis, 1983. This is a pretty good album, except, well, you know, I was born in the mid-70s. Although there was always music playing in my house, my parents were not into prog rock. So my introduction to Genesis was the video for That's All on MTV. I loved it. In fact, some of my early favorite songs on MTV when I was about 10 were that, Owner of a Lonely Heart by Yes, and Peter Gabriel's Shock the Monkey. Speaking of shock, imagine my shock when I first learned a couple years later that Peter Gabriel was the original lead singer for Genesis. But even though Genesis had been releasing music for nearly a decade and a half, this was the album they chose as their self-title. Side 1 begins with the smoldering, brooding, and, as I can recognize as an adult, aggressively sexual Mama. It's a mood that I have to say works really well. Although it's one of the most minimalist tracks the band ever produced, it's hard to deny that it's also one of their best. Next up is my beloved That's All, followed by the essential nod to prog that appears on every 80s Genesis album, an extended two-part suite. Here it's the excellent Home by the Sea / Second Home by the Sea. Side 1 may not exactly be a prog tour de force, but it's some excellent listening that I'd put up against anything the band ever did. Side 2 is much more of a mixed bag. Musically, it's all pretty decent, but okay, I have to talk about the elephant in the room. Illegal Alien, a loaded term that I generally avoid using, except when I have to because it's the title of a song I'm talking about, is a solid 5 minutes of cringe. Honestly, I feel like the band had good intentions. The lyrics are clumsy but sympathetic. The accent, that was a really bad idea. What bugs me most, though, is that musically the song is really catchy. I'd say that Only Devo's Mongoloid, a title I'm even more uncomfortable saying out loud, is a more insidiously effective combination of music that I want to listen to with lyrics I don't. In Devo's case, that discomfort is definitely the point. Genesis, I'm not so sure. I kind of think so, but Phil Collins isn't cynical enough to pull it off. Number 7, Nursery Crime, 1971. At last, the classic 5-piece lineup of Genesis was complete, with the phenomenal skills of Steve Hackett and Phil Collins brought into the fold. The legend is that Phil Collins arrived early for his audition and waited outside by the pool for the drummer before him to finish. He took that opportunity to listen closely to what was happening, so when his turn came, he already was familiar with the music and he nailed the audition.
Nailed it.
All of the promise that was just a whisper of a suggestion of a hint on From Genesis to Revelation, and that was growing stronger on Trespass, finally comes into full bloom here on their third album. In fact, this album sounds so naturally, inevitably like Genesis that it's hard to believe the band didn't appear like this fully formed. And the boys were just barely into their 20s at the time. Every track here is great, both for the diverse, dazzling music and for the richly evocative, character-driven storytelling that became a key part of Peter Gabriel's high-concept, on-stage persona throughout his years with the band. My favorite track is The Fountain of Salmacis, which has my second favorite mellotron playing on a Genesis album. Don't worry, the best is yet to come. Number 6, Wind and Wuthering, 1976. Also known as A Trick of the Tail Part 2. Well, maybe not. But as the only two albums that feature the quartet lineup that was left behind after Peter Gabriel quit, they are a unique pair that have more in common than any two albums in the band's catalog, with the possible exception of Nursery Crime and Foxtrot. Certain albums become inextricably tied to a time in your life, and just hearing them can transport you back to that moment. When that happens, it's hard to be objective about the qualities of the music itself. That's how I feel about Wind and Wuthering. It's forever connected for me to the beginning of my freshman year of college in the early 1990s. I had just really gotten into Genesis over the summer, diving into the Peter Gabriel era albums. By the time I was off and living on my own for the first time in my life, I was deep into this album. Everything about it just feels like that first semester away from home, sitting in my dorm room, watching autumn fade into winter, and feeling the churning mix of both anxiety and anticipation. That's Wind and Wuthering to me. The title even fits. Number 5, Foxtrot, 1972. It was pretty much a rite of passage for any progressive rock band in the 1970s to produce at least one sidelong suite, a quasi-symphony consisting of multiple musical ideas segued together, with some semblance of a cohesive story, and taking up one entire side of an LP. Okay, technically Supper's Ready is not the entire side 2 of Foxtrot. It starts with a brief, apparently unrelated solo guitar piece. But in classic Genesis fashion of cramming an incomprehensible amount of music onto a single LP, its 23-minute runtime is one of the longest of any 70s prog suite. Dream Theater could not have handled recording under the constraints of the 1970s. Honestly, if there's a cohesive story to Supper's Ready, it takes more imagination than I have. But the suite is so creative and varied and comes to such an epic conclusion that it feels like you've gone on a transformative journey, even if you have no idea exactly where you were at any point along the way. For me, though, the standout track on Foxtrot is the side 1 opener, Watcher of the Skies, which begins with a minute plus of the most quintessential mellotron ever put on record. Number 4, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, 1974. This is the kind of album that destroys a band. I mean, after you produce a massively ambitious double album, where can you go from there? Unless you're a band like Chicago that starts with a massively ambitious double album. Unlike Chicago, Genesis didn't need to pad out their double album with a 14-minute group jam or 7 minutes of unaccompanied guitar noodling. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is packed to the gills with dense musical storytelling and considerably fewer minutes of questionably conceived musique concrète experimentation than even the Beatles resorted to. The story in this concept album is surreal and hard to parse, and it led to some of Peter Gabriel's most ludicrous stage costumes ever, including one so cumbersome that he couldn't actually hold his microphone near his face. But honestly, a strong and cohesive story doesn't even matter that much to me here. It's more of a loose thread connecting a collection of fantastical scenes from the underbelly, if not the literal sewers, of a modern city. It's a grittier version of Alice in Wonderland. I feel like there's a lot of metaphor and perhaps psychoanalytic symbolism that still goes over my head 3.5 decades after I first heard the album. Also, probably drugs.
Drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs.
Look, I'm not a total square, but I'll admit my experience in that regard is pretty limited and not entirely pleasant. I'm just saying, I don't really know what this album is about, and I'm okay with that. Musically, the album is pretty amazing, and some of that aforementioned experimentation includes a bit of Enossification by Brian Eno. I can't think of a single album that wasn't made better by Brian Eno's involvement. Possibly the most striking thing about this album, apart from the fact that Peter Gabriel was done with the band after it, was that its grimy modern tale of an American street punk came immediately after the Baroque structures and quaint Britishness of Selling England by the Pound, which is next up. Number 3, Selling England by the Pound, 1973. Some might argue that The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is the pinnacle of the band's work with Peter Gabriel, but that album had some faults. Lyrically, it wasn't really collaborative, and being stretched to a double album, it has some experimental filler that wasn't maybe essential to the whole. None of those criticisms can be levied against its predecessor, Selling England by the Pound. And at 54 minutes, it's nearly a double album itself. In fact, I've often wondered how Genesis managed to consistently stuff 50-plus minutes of music onto a single LP, which significantly exceeds the generally recognized practical limit of roughly 22 minutes per side. This is a bit of a tangent, but I find it kind of fascinating, since those practical limitations unquestionably created parameters ambitious 70s rock musicians had to work within. Again, Dream Theater never would have made it. What's interesting about vinyl is that it's not like CDs or any other digital medium where capacity is a hard limit. The actual amount of music you can cram onto an LP varies by how loud the music is. Genesis was able to fit more music onto their albums because many of their songs had very light, delicate sections, and I believe the overall mastering level was lower than was typical. Quieter music correlates to a shallower groove in the vinyl, and therefore the groove spacing can be tighter, which means you can fit more music on a side. So, Selling England by the Pound is a remarkable album quantitatively, but how good is all of that music? Quite good, I would say. The band's compositional skills were at their absolute peak, and their technical proficiency on their instruments was up to the task. There are moments of beautiful, delicate, intricate detail, powerful, cathartic, all-out rock, and some of Peter Gabriel's best, most sardonic lyrics, full of allegorical critiques of the stratified English society of the 1970s. It's a truly excellent album, and it benefits from the best production on any of the Gabriel-era albums. Crystal clear, simultaneously fragile and potent, and perfectly capturing every nuance. I love it. So, why isn't it at the top of this list? Well, I've got my reasons. Okay, well, with that, I've already mentioned all of the Peter Gabriel albums, and I still have 2 to go. Let's see which ones they are and in which order. Number 2, A Trick of the Tail, 1976. As much as I think Peter Gabriel was essential to the development of the Genesis sound, I also feel like the band really perfected that sound after he left. Just as there's a legend around Phil getting the drummer gig before Nursery Crime, there's a similar one here with how he ended up singing lead vocals. He had already been singing backing vocals, along with a few scattered leads throughout his time in the band. While auditioning possible replacements for Peter Gabriel, Phil Collins taught them the vocal lines. Eventually, it became apparent that Phil could handle lead vocals better than any of the candidates, which wouldn't be a problem in the studio, but they'd have to find a solution for live performances. That ended up being Bill Bruford of Yes and King Crimson for the first tour, making him the only person ever to play with all 3 bands. Chester Thompson, who had played with Frank Zappa, got the call for every subsequent tour for the rest of the band's career. But back to the album. A Trick of the Tail was the best-sounding Genesis album to date, and the excellent production highlighted both the quality of the compositions and the dexterity of the band's performances. Sonically, this album covers as much ground as any Genesis album, from the delicate vocals and 12-string guitar of tracks like Ripples and Entangled, to the Led Zeppelin-inspired punch of Squonk. There's the magical imagery of the title track, hairpin turns in the opener, Dance on a Volcano, and whimsical storytelling in Robbery, Assault, and Battery. In short, A Trick of the Tail has everything I could want in a Genesis album. Almost. Which is why it's number 2 on the list. Number 1, Duke, 1980. I know some Genesis fans might think I'm crazy for picking this album as my favorite. Prog fans think it's too poppy. Pop fans think it's too proggy. Funny enough, I think it's just right. It's perhaps an artifact of the weird way I came to be a fan of this band, with my introduction to them and Peter Gabriel separately coming from their big hits being played on MTV when I was in elementary school in the early 1980s, followed by my absolute obsession with prog rock in high school and college in the early 1990s. Duke hits the sweet spot between both. The one thing I found missing on A Trick of the Tail was an overarching concept that tied it all together. It was a great collection of songs, but they all stood alone. Now, the band will deny that Duke is a concept album, but I hear a concept in it, even if they don't. It's at least as cohesive as Lamb, and a lot more relatable. As I envision it, the story is about 2 characters, the titular Duke and Duchess, whose story is told mainly in the second track. Duchess is a pop star. They're in a relationship. But her massive success and his insecurity drive them apart. The rest of the album is his quest initially to reconnect with her, then eventually to find some kind of meaning in his life without her. I could go into extensive detail piecing together the story, but honestly, that seems like something I should maybe save for a follow-up video. For now, I'll just say that I find the album incredibly compelling, and I think musically it's a perfect blend of prog ambition and pop sensibility. I love the fact that one of the centerpiece tracks, Turn It On Again, is built on a riff Mike Rutherford brought to the band, thinking it was a straightforward 4/4. But when he sat down to play it, Phil Collins informed him it was actually alternating bars of 6/4 and 7/4. Genesis just could not shake prog rock no matter how hard they tried. Misunderstanding was a guaranteed pop hit in 6/8, but it still fits well into the album. And the extended Duke's Travels / Duke's End suite has enough twists and turns to satisfy any prog rock fan. But the song that really sticks for me, as the emotional fulcrum of the album, is Please Don't Ask. It's the moment in the story when these two exes encounter each other after years apart. The narrator tries to put on a brave face, even as he's finally forced to confront just how much he's lost. The music ebbs and flows perfectly with the lyrics for maximum impact without getting cheesy. And so I think this is the one Genesis album where all of the various threads that have always interested me about their music, rich harmonies, adventurous compositions, skillful playing, and engaging storytelling, come together in a package that's immediately accessible but never wears thin, no matter how many times I listen to it. And, no surprise, I've listened to this album a lot. I don't actually have a desert island list of, say, my top 10 most essential albums, but if I did, Duke would be on it. Wait, why don't I have a desert island list? I better get on that and make another video. Before I go, I just want to mention the Genesis album covers. I made a big deal about album covers in my Yes ranking video, but that's partly because Yes album covers are kind of a whole thing unto themselves, thanks to the distinctive and beloved work of Roger Dean. Genesis album covers aren't quite as notoriously awful as Steely Dan's, but they're also generally kind of underwhelming. So I'm not going to rank them all, but I am going to call out my 4 favorites, just in chronological order. The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, A Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering, and Duke. I feel like Genesis was trying to create their own visual vibe with the Paul Whitehead covers for Nursery Crime and Foxtrot, and his band logo that was also used on Genesis Live and various things after that, but it just never clicked in the same way as Roger Dean's work for Yes. Oh well. I do appreciate good cover art, but a bad cover doesn't negatively affect my opinion of the music on the record. Again, Steely Dan. That's it for this one. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Click all of the stuff down there. Thanks for watching. Okay, wait. There's one more thing I can't leave unmentioned. Back in 2007, all of the Genesis albums were remastered for a new set of CDs. This was right around the time of the Loudness Wars really ramping up. The remasters were given a massive dose of dynamic compression to make them all sound more modern. All they did was squash the hell out of all the details in the louder sections of the music. The drums in particular sound terrible, and the whole thing leads to auditory fatigue pretty quickly, especially in headphones. I desperately wish the band would hire Steven Wilson to remix their albums and fix this, because nearly 2 decades later, these horrible 2007 masters are still the only versions available on streaming services. They did release a new remastered 50th anniversary version of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway in 2025. It's better, but it still seems pretty compressed to me. It's just not what it could be. And of course, that's just one album. The earliest CD releases from the 1980s were, in my opinion, kind of poorly done, but if you can find the excellent 1994 remasters, or even better, old vinyl, it's really the best way to hear this music. Genesis is an incredibly dynamic band, and their music deserves to be experienced in all of its subtle, nuanced glory.